Neil, first of all, congratulations on a cracking opening episode and also for a hugely successful first series. It was very well received, as we heard at the beginning. Did you always plan for this to be a two-series story?
Yes, definitely. There was a not hugely subtle ending to the first series that sort of begets a second series, but I think there's a very natural division within the story into two halves, not just the gold in terms of the characters they bring in. So I always saw it as a two-series show, and very thankful to the BBC and all three media for helping us get it over the line.
Mm. And this series feels even more ambitious than the last in terms of the new level of money laundering and the professional crime, and also it's set in multiple geographical locations. I know mostly it was filmed in Tenerife. Can you talk a little bit about that and also what your ambitions were and the big themes this series?
Yeah, I think it's very expansive. It had to kind of grow in impact and where the story went, and it gets even further from the Brinksmat warehouse in the first series, but still starts there, which I think is important. You know, it's still the second half of the gold, but it reaches further chronologically eventually into the 90s, and I think that it was even harder for the people involved with this half to get rid of it, if you like, and particularly to handle the money that came from it. And business was becoming more international, so crime became more international, and it's an even more aspirant time, if you like, even though there was also a recession in Britain, which I thought was very interesting, so the money gravitated abroad very quickly. So it was great just to send the story into new worlds and bring in new characters and feel that we were being even more expansive and reaching even closer to the kind of current time.
Mm. Can you talk a bit about the locations, like where it will be? Because we'll see some more obviously in the second episode, but we've seen the Earl. Yeah,
I mean, this shoot, it was a big challenge for us all. Ben Farrell and Charlie Leach, producers, Patrick Harkins, who directed all 6 episodes. It was certainly more challenging just in terms of working out where all these worlds would go. Half the shoot was in Tenerife, half was in the UK. Tenerife played for about 5 countries, I think, which did so remarkably well. It's an amazing place, great kind of variance in the backdrops. But certainly the worlds that we go into we spend a lot of time in Tenerife, obviously through John Palmer, but we end up in the Caribbean and the British Virgin Islands, where the money mixes, without giving too much away, where the money mixes with kind of very high-level money laundering with American crime cartels, South American crime cartels. So it's just a constant source of surprise and excitement, the Brinksmat story, and it really does give so much. And it was just a pleasure again to try and corral such a complicated story into 6 episodes of television.
Quite a feat. You talked before about how much you've enjoyed the research part of this, with your team. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that process, but also how it feels when you kind of hit upon a golden nugget, if you like, of a part of the story that hasn't been reported on before.
Well, I think what was interesting researching this series is it's even less well known than the first series, for a couple of reasons, one of which a lot of people involved in the crimes that we show in this series didn't get caught. So there's no court proceedings to work from, and they're not keen to tell their story because they got away with it. So, and then there's a very key character in the series that went into witness protection. So again, that never comes out in court if someone goes into witness protection. So it was even harder to research, but kind of more rewarding as a result, I think, because I feel that we're telling a story in this series that is very, very little's known about it, But certainly in the research, it's a great joy. Thomas turned to the first series. Adam Fenn worked with me on the second series. And Adam just trawling through newspaper archives. None of this is online. And it's sort of late 80s, early 90s. But for example, the Cornish tin mine storyline in the first episode, that comes from one paragraph of an Evening Standard article in the late 80s. And it was... It just mentioned that Cornish police were leading this extensive hunt over the moors for Brinksmat gold, having discovered links between one of the original robbers and the local area. So when you see something like that, it's fantastic. And in this case, I've obviously extrapolated that out into kind of significant storyline in the opening episode.
Must be satisfying.
Very much so, yeah.
Hugh, Boyce is back, and he's under a lot of pressure, told in no uncertain terms he has to wrap this case up, he has to succeed. How does he handle this pressure? And also, how have your past conversations with the real Brian Boyce helped inform your performance this time round?
Well, I think all credit to Neil, really, because as you may or may not gather as the show goes on, a lot of time has been compressed. Actually, a lot of these events took place over 10 years, really, because the trials, put it this way, the trials were still going on 10 years later, by which time the spotlight was well off the national interest. The powers that be upstairs, as we've begun to see, are saying, you're wasting our money, this is wasting police time and resources. We've been downgraded to a basement off Tottenham Court Road, basically, and there's about 3 of us on the case still. So that sense of pressure, and pressure from above particularly, is huge. And it becomes clear later on that actually, this simple, dogged police work is actually bringing in huge revenue with each trial and each reclamation of funds. That far outweighs the expense that is being incurred by the actual investigation. So it's sort of David and Goliath, really, in one sense, that the money, as we see in the lifestyle. I love the juxtaposition of us in our basement and John Palmer having the life of Riley, living it up, and what's not to like, and yet we are trying to do the right thing. So I love that juxtaposition, and I love the sense that this little triumvirate are going to try and hang on to what is right and do the right thing, whatever they're faced with.
Mm. And as you say, the team's been stripped back, and you still got Jennings and Brightwell, which is a good thing. But of course, now you're taking on Lundy, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about, first of all, how Boyce feels about taking him on, and the effect Lundy has on the dynamics of the team and on the investigation.
Well, to pick up on what you were asking about, the real Brian Boyce, who I had the pleasure of meeting twice through Neil, once before, just as we were starting shooting, and once after he'd seen the first season, and he gave it a thumbs up. So that was, we were all very proud of that. But really, having got to know Brian a tiny bit, and you really do see a man, if you chopped him in half, you'd see police written all the way through and doing the right thing all the way through. He was incorruptible, which is why at one stage in his career, MI5 suggested him for someone who wanted a certain investigation done, because he, unlike certain others in the Metropolitan Police and other police forces, had not been got at by money. And so he was absolutely a man of principle and integrity. And so when he come across a character like Lundy, and this is developed a little further in the later episodes, as we've already seen, Stephen Campbell-Moore, who plays Lundy, is a man who flies quite close to the wind, but he gets results. And bearing in mind the pressure that you were alluding to from above, I think Brian Boyce decides, it's better to have someone like that on the inside who can actually help. And so long as as long as Boyce doesn't know what's happening, then it's a good ally to have in the camp. Whatever, and it's interesting that they both Brightwell and Jennings have an initial reaction to him. The word on the street is he's a bent copper, and we don't work with bent coppers. But he's been cleared, and therefore, on paper, he's someone to be better to have on the inside of the camp.
And he gets results, which is the main thing.
And gets results, as we shall see later.
Yeah. Boyce goes to Tenerife to do his own surveilling, which is quite fun. I wanted to find out how that was, filming in Tenerife. I mean, personally, I was just excited to see Boyce's summer wardrobe.
Yes, as is expanded on, and indeed there will be a sideline of the Boyce summer wear in non-iron nylon shirts and sensible trousers. It was great. I mean, yes, Boyce actually says, I'm going on holiday, and then he turns up actually on surveillance. So, he's not a man who takes a holiday. But filming in Tenerife was great. I was in the genuinely Tenerife bit. I wasn't in Tortola or the other bits of Tenerife that doubled and tripled as other countries. It was warm. And in fact, one moment I do remember is, it hasn't come into play yet, but opposite the El Dorado building, there was an Irish cafe, Irish bar, wasn't there, serving all day breakfast. And just for the purposes of our shoot, it was suddenly changed into a British bar. But we had to be very quiet about it before the Irish got cross that all the paraphernalia out front had been replaced as an all-day English pub.
Very good.
But no, it was fun. It was fun to film there, and it was quite weird actually. Sometimes, do you remember when some punters would come up looking not unlike the people who'd been sold timeshares, and you thought, are they coming up to shake hands with the team or to say you owe me money, or what is it? But it's very much the same clientele.
Sounds like a fun shoot. Charlotte, let's talk about Nikki. She's an amalgamation of several female officers who worked on the case. Yes. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about her evolution since Series 1.
Is this... Oh, it worked. Yeah. I mean, basically, now she is... she knows what she's doing now. She doesn't have to prove herself anymore. She's in. So, unlike before where she was, desperately trying to get in with Boyce, she's good. And I think she knows where she's at. And, the only female officer there, or a detective there, so quite proud of that. So she just knows who she is now. She's not trying so hard, I don't think. How
does she cope in that predominantly male-dominated environment, and also with Lundy as well?
Yeah, I mean, she doesn't like Lundy at all. And I've said this before in an interview, for some reason I have this habit of comparing my characters to animals. Don't know why. I just think that she's a Rottweiler. And I think that she's incredibly loyal, particularly to Boyce. And she, like you said, she wants to do good. And I actually think in a world now where we have a lot of, we love our anti-heroes, I'm kind of no, maybe we should like the heroes again. They might be not as exciting as these guys, but actually, the will to good should be something that we should be doing ourselves and proud of. And I think that a character like that is kind of amazing, that she just wants to do good. And, what was interesting at Neil, how Neil wrote her, was that she came from that same background, but the difference was she chose to do good. She could have gone down that path as well, but she didn't.
Yeah.
And I think there are people out there that exist like that. So, yeah.
And she will do good, but she will bare her teeth if necessary.
Absolutely. She will bring out the Rottweiler if needs be. So, yeah.
I wanted to find out, I know Series 1 you were sort of obsessed with the 80s phones.
Yeah, I'm obsessed
What about this
with
set
them.
now?
Still? I'm still obsessed with the phones. I mean, then we had, I don't think we really get to see many, but then it was the bricks. And it was just great. And I was just obsessed with any phone that was there. I was like, oh my God, look, it's on a wire. I just thought it was great. But yeah, I did. That was me playing. It's like being an actor is like playing pretend, like being at play school and picking up the old things. And I loved all that stuff.
Did any of them make their way into your bag?
No.
Okay, fine.
She's a detective,
yeah,
for goodness sake.
Tom, let's talk about John. So he's a self-made man, criminal, who is always trying to prove himself. And as we see, that might lead to his downfall, with that Times piece, for example. Can you tell us a bit about where we find him, what he's up to in Tenerife, and his motivation?
Yeah, to go up what Neil was saying, we had kind of always had in our mind that this was going to be a 2-season show. So when first started shooting, the arc of John was very much in my mind. And we'd talked about the gold kind of acting like a kind of infection that gets into you and takes over. And Neil, who was the director in the first season, I remember the first time we meet John, he is with Noy, and there's a moment where he sees the gold and he's kind of resisting it. He knows that it's wrong, but as soon as he sees that gold, and I think Neil kind of shone a light off this gold and onto my eyes, and from that moment on, it kind of sets off a chain of events inside John. He is a guy in real life. He's a guy from Solihull. He grew up, as Neil writes about in season 1. He grew up next to a dump, and he was so poor he didn't have shoes. You could tell how poor he was because I think he had holes in his I can't quite remember the detail, but he had holes in his boots, which mean they were given to him. And so he's a guy that's driven to better himself. But in a way, the gold kind of represents the infection, as I said, in that it becomes greed. So what becomes self-betterment takes over. And as we go through season 2, the line between greed and self-betterment becomes very, very murky. So at the top of season 2, he's kind of at his zenith, I suppose. He's running this very successful timeshare business, and season 2 is very much a kind of about how greed can dismantle a person, and it certainly dismantles him.
Mm. It's incredibly corruptive, and we see with his wife Marnie, she desperately wants him home, but he's resistant. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think Marnie is a really important character. I think that she represents his, who he really is, his truth, I suppsuppose, as a family man. And I think that John is able to lie to himself and tell himself that, our John, that this is what he's doing it for, is for his wife and for his children. And I think that anybody who does anything bad never thinks that they're doing anything bad, and we justify it to ourselves. As humans, and all the time, we're constantly the hero of our own stories. And Marnie's a really important pivot for John, I think. She represents to him who he is. And as far as he's concerned, it's the same person. But in our show, kind of dramatically, I suppose, Marnie is that pivot, and that kind of shows how far he is actually going and descending. And you kind of want him just to stop. That's the brilliance of Neil's writing. He kind of constantly creates these frictions and these dramas that are character-led, not just about kind of money laundering. It's a very human story, really.
His success and his social standing is very much, and his affluence is represented in his wardrobe. Like, how much did you enjoy those oversized suits and ties? Yeah,
well, again, going back to what I said, we knew that there was going to be a 2-season arc. So Grace, our absolutely phenomenal costume designer, and both of our makeup designers, Sophie Slotver in season 2, we discussed about how to evolve him. And even in season 1, I'd seen these clips of him. There are photos of him when he initially had kind of been pinned as part of the Brinksmack case, and he's kind of wearing jeans and these jumpers, and so we really lent into that. And Grace really pulled this amazing wardrobe. I just felt like my dad from the 80s. But then I saw this picture of him when he had been arrested. There's a footage of him getting into a car after he landed back from Brazil, and he looked different. He had a nice suit, and we wanted to kind of evolve that. And as he went into the 90s, he wore these suits, and he kind of wanted, what I felt was that we wanted to kind of him to feel like he was stepping into this wealth and starting to kind of change himself from the outside in. I'm sure inside he's still that poor boy with holes in his shoes from Solihull. And so the affluence and the suits are a projection of who he feels like he wants to be, and probably feels pretty uncomfortable in it. And Grace was great. I remember my first costume fitting. We went to this amazing warehouse where this guy, I can't remember his name. I wish I could. He's collected these suits from generations, and it's phenomenal. So I'm wearing kind of really Armani and Gucci suits from the period, but they're so ridiculously big. Again, I just felt like I was wearing my dad's clothes. But I was 6 years old. So those shoulder pads are just phenomenal. But I loved it, and the collection of ties just kind of got more and more hideous. The more hideous, the better, I think.
Yeah, listen, the bigger the better, and the more hideous the better. Neil, I want to talk about the other two. I know many new characters, but the two new characters in particular. Douglas Baxter, who I'm sort of obsessed with. And also, I think we'll see more in episode 2, the enigmatic Logan Campbell, played by Tom Hughes, also a great character. Can you talk a bit about them?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Douglas Baxter, Joshua Maguire is fantastic in this series, and then Logan Campbell, played by Tom, who's here tonight, Tom Hughes, and they represent this really interesting money laundering route that kind of ran from South London through the Isle of Man to Tortola and the British Virgin Islands, and they're great kind of foils for each other, if you like. and they're very much inspired by the research and everything else. But the I think the money laundering worlds, we did a bit of that in series 1, but it was quite specific and it was quite low level and it was quite embryonic. People were trying to work out how to do it. I think what's interesting, the stage of criminality that this series exists in, is that money laundering had become fairly established and at a kind of international level, and the Brinks-Mat money just went off into there and drew in all these characters and all these areas of criminality that are brilliant. But the both performances are fantastic, very different, which is what you want in an ensemble cast, and their characters kind of grow and grow. Sam Spruill, who was glimpsed in series 1, but very much glimpsed at the end, he develops into this brilliant journey as well. Rochelle Neal, there's so many great new kind of actors that kind of come into it. And then, so for me, having the returning cast that we had, and some of them come later in the series in kind of interesting ways, and then blending that with these key new parts was just really satisfying, and I think they kind of came together really well.
Got a lot to look forward to in the upcoming episodes. I think now we have some time for some questions from the audience. So if you've got a question, there's roaming mics, apparently. Yeah?
Just want a seat. One for Neil, because it's a historical topic, just fascinated on the writing front, of how you take that whole huge story over years and then sort of think, like, how do you structure that if it's going over years, and how do you... It's a massive question, I know, for writing. How do you go about structuring it and bringing it all together in something that takes so long into a compact show?
It's kind of the same principles as any area of kind of dramatising it. It's such a complicated story. It's so sprawling. I mean, it's such a huge story. I wrote a book with Thomas Turner, who researched the first series, because there was just so much story that we couldn't use. And to kind of boil that down into 6 episodes, you're constantly making decisions about whose story you're going to follow. Compositing is a big thing. You composite characters, you also composite story. And then, the storylines, the chronologies of all these things are clearly not as neat as you'd want them to be in television. So you do have to work on that as well. And it's creative license, which is the job of dramatisation, that people use it in a pejorative sense, which is kind of barmy because it's what you've got to do. So it's just trying to take this very complicated thing, slim it down, simplify it where you can, so you can then, if you make it very simple, you can then make it complicated in terms of characterisation and relationships and everything else. So it's hard sometimes, and the biggest thing is all the great story that doesn't end up in, because it's really fascinating in its own right, but it just doesn't tie into the kind of wider storylines. But I think we kind of, for me, it's about, it doesn't just have to be a great storyline in itself. It has to fit into what we're trying to do overall, and the kind of maybe the themes and everything else. So it's not easy. There's a lot left in the kind of cutting room floor, both in the writing and in the edit.
Yeah, it's about writing and structuring again. So you've got a chunk of the audience, big chunk of the audience watching on live TV over a number of nights. And then you've got people watching as a box set. And when you're writing it, do you think about both audiences, one of those audiences first and foremost, or do you think about it in a completely different way because that's the way you write?
I think I probably think about them in the same way, in terms of you want people to keep watching on a kind of basic level. And I think that I do think about, you want to do lots of things with a television show, and you can have quite grandiose approaches and things that you like to address, and themes and thematic storytelling, all that stuff. But I think you've got to recognise I always recognise your main responsibility is entertainment. And I do think about people who are watching 10 minutes in, why are they still watching? People who have watched one episode, why are they still going to watch? I think you've got to take your storytelling responsibility seriously, I think. And if you go down the rabbit hole of some of these other areas and some of these other things that people might latch onto a television show, I think you lose sight of the story. And I think, so definitely, I narratively like to feel that an episode of television is its own story, and you want a singular story to have a satisfying and exciting ending that also is propulsive into the next episode. So I take structure very seriously, much more seriously than I did when I was younger. It's the be all and end all, really. You'd hope that over time, with experience and hard work, you can reach a certain level of dramatisation. But if you don't structure it, you're not going to take people along with you. And I think so. I spent a long time structuring the story, and the gold through necessity, through the complications of getting the storylines to tie together, but also on that fundamental basis of taking the viewer with you and making them want to keep watching.
There's another question at the back.
It's a question for Hugh. You're best known for playing good guys. Is that partly because that's what you prefer? And will we ever see you play a baddie?
Wait to episode 3. Well, the devil always has the best tunes. Actually, it's great playing a character like Boyce especially because having met the man, he's not just all virtue. There are so many levels to the reason he is as he is, like all human beings. No, I've done my fair share of serial killers, I'll have you know. But wait for Paddington 5.
Don't even joke about that, Hugh.